Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Former UKIP leader Nigel Farage says he may have reached the point of thinking that there should be a second referendum on Brexit. So Nigel Farage's comments have raised an eyebrow or two, even amongst his many supporters. He said on Twitter, maybe, just maybe, we should have a second referendum on EU membership. It would kill off the issue for a generation once and for all. Well, his comments have been supported by Aaron Banks, co-founder of the Leave EU campaign. But would a second referendum actually draw a line under the issue, whichever way it went? Well, from Westminster, I'm joined now by Geraint Davies, Labour MP and member of the European Security Committee, and Conservative MP Sir Bill Cash. Very good to talk to you both. If I can start with you first, Mr Davies. I know you've campaigned for a second referendum, but it was made very clear, crystal clear to the electorate before the last one in 2016 by David Cameron, the then Prime Minister. He said it in a speech at Chatham House. He put it in the leaflet that went to every household in Britain saying, this is a one-off, it's irrevocable.
Yeah, well, people were promised they'd have more money, £350 million a week for the NHS. They were promised by David Cameron they'd be part of the single market, and we won't be, and of course we'll lose jobs because of that. We were promised we'd take control, and our rights and protections are in jeopardy. And people in Swansea and elsewhere are saying to me, this isn't what we voted for, and basically they want to say on the exit deal, people have voted in good faith to leave, but now they may have ordered a steak in a restaurant, ended up with a chewed up bit of bacon. They want the right to send it back, and if they're not happy with what they get, if it doesn't resemble their reasonable expectations, they want the right to send it back, and that's democracy. And now the two extremes of this debate, which is Blair and Farage, have come out calling for a referendum. People do deserve a referendum on the exit package, which is quite different from the principal referendum we had before.
OK, Sir Bill Cash, well, you heard it there. Mr Davies is too polite to say it. He's saying more or less the electorate was lied to, particularly about this 350 million quid for the NHS.
Well, that's not my line at all, as it happens, but I can only say this, that as regards the turnout, it was the biggest electoral vote in our political history. It was a significant majority. It was authorised by Act of Parliament. And in order to have another referendum, you'd have to have another Act of Parliament, and you'd also have to repeal the Article 50 Act, which has just been passed in Parliament by 499 votes and is going to go through the House of Commons next Wednesday or Thursday. So for practical purposes, we've got a completely 100% democratic decision that was taken both by Parliament and by the people, and there is absolutely no need for this referendum, second referendum at all. And by the way, I have to say that the idea of the Labour Party, or parts of it, and the Liberal Democrats and Nigel Farage being, as it were, in bed together is one of the funniest things I've ever seen.
Yeah, but I just want to interject there before I go back to Mr Davies, because he'd make this point to you, because you haven't addressed it yourself. You're saying, well, no need for this referendum. Well, Mr Davies, and indeed some others are saying, some people who voted leave are saying, well, we didn't vote, we didn't know this was going to happen. And I refer to the NHS issue in particular and some of the ones that Mr Davies touched on.
Well, on the NHS issue, I think that is a specific question on which I personally didn't agree with the Vote Leave campaign, but that is secondary to the democratic question. This withdrawal bill actually repeals the 1972 Act, and that includes all the treaties and it includes all the laws that have been passed by the European community since 1972.
I have to go back to Mr Davies, because you didn't quite answer my first question to you as well, which was about the sovereignty of the people. This issue was given to the people of the United Kingdom, and they decided decisively that they wanted to leave the European Union. Now, even if there were another referendum which went the way you want it to go, that wouldn't settle the issue, would it? It would be 1-1. You'd have to have a third one.
Well, no, as Keynes famously said, when the facts change, I change my mind. And at the moment, 51% of people want to remain, 41% want to leave, and the rest don't know. half the people want a second referendum on the exit deal as opposed to in principle, and a third say no. So, I mean, we have in Britain, our democracy consists of general elections normally, but we've had 3 in the last 7 years. I think on this momentous change, which will change countless generations' prospects in the future, people do deserve the final say. Now they've got the information in front of them, which is inflation, job losses, less money, less control, and trade tariffs, which they basically think is something that's served up that they weren't unable to know beforehand. They've seen the truth. They don't like it. They should have the right to send it back.
Just one quick response to that, if I may. Frankly, I don't know where Geraint's getting his evidence from, but YouGov, 11th of December, quite clearly stated 52% want to get on with Brexit. Only 16% wanted a second referendum.
Well, surely you don't believe polls, Sir Bill, after the results of the referendum. I mean, all the polls showed Remain in the lead right up to the final hour.
Oh, well, wait a minute. We got the result that we wanted. I'm talking about 16% want a second referendum. I mean, that really is a huge difference.
Well, Survation, which is the most reliable indicator before the last election, is saying these numbers. But let's settle it once and for all. That's what Farage is saying. That's what Blair is saying. They're either side of, the extremes of this debate. Let's have some democracy. This is a momentous decision. Let's give people the chance to vote. Now they can see the jobs going, the prices rising, the promises being unfulfilled. They deserve that, and I believe the main political parties, both yours and mine, Bill, will come and eventually they're going to have to jump unless they're pushed towards having another vote on this.
No, last question. I just want to get a last thought into you, Sir Bill. What about a vote on the Brexit deal? Because a lot of people, I'm not sure if they include you on the Leave side, believe they might be being sold a pup. Huge payments are going to be continued to be made to the European Union.
Sorry, that's what I'm talking about. So we're clear on this. I'm not talking about a rerun of Bill's referendum. I'm talking about the Brexit deal. Let's be clear about that.
Well, you might vote against the Brexit deal, Sir Bill, if it's too generous in your estimation to the European Union.
Well, can I say this? The Withdrawal Act, the withdrawal bill is going through. The second thing I would say is that as far as the British democracy and accountability is concerned, we're returning sovereignty to Parliament, and in addition to that, we will then make our own laws based upon our decisions, based on general elections by the British people.
But
that's where it should be.
But wouldn't you like to vote? Let's just say the final deal ends up with a Norway-type vision. You'd like to vote against that, wouldn't you?
Oh, that is not on the offer. She's already said that is, no, it isn't, because she said that was not going to be. It was in the Farage speech, and it's been in subsequent speeches. That is not the way it's going.
Just let me put it to Geraint Davis. I'm sorry to hurry you both, gentlemen, but just we are running out of time. But Geraint Davis, I mean, the other side of that, if you've got a kind of Norway-type deal, wouldn't you be better off settling for that than risking the fact that Leave might win by an even more substantial margin?
No, I believe in democracy. Obviously, Bill's a sort of Brexit fundamentalist. I'm a Democrat, but I think it's clearly and now and demonstrably not in the interest of Britain to go ahead. We need a proper vote on the Brexit deal. If the deal is rubbish and people are worse off and we're impoverished and our rights are taken away and all the rest of it, people should rightly vote against it. But if they still decide, despite all the evidence, to go ahead, that's up to them.
All right. Well, Nigel Farage certainly put the cat amongst the pigeons. Thank you both very much indeed for your views. Geraint Davis and Sir Bill Cash.
Former UKIP leader and Brexit campaigner Nigel Farage has raised a few eyebrows today by claiming that he's open to the idea of a second EU referendum. He said on Twitter, teasingly, maybe, just maybe, we should have a second referendum on EU membership. It would kill off the issue for a generation once and for all. His sentiments have subsequently been backed by Leave EU financier Aaron Banks. Let's talk this through in Westminster with Nigel Evans, Conservative MP and Brexit campaigner. Nigel Evans, welcome to you.
Thank you.
This, he says, would kill it off once and for all.
Well, maybe, just maybe, Nigel Farage should go away. Let's be fair. Aaron Banks in 2016 said that the idea of a second referendum would be a stunt and nuts. Even Nigel Farage in 2016 said that he definitely didn't want a second referendum. So it's not going to happen. I mean, poor old Nigel, I know that we've not seen much of him since the referendum had been held, but he's like one of those fruit machines that sits in a pub. And if nobody plays it for a while, it then springs into action with some irritating noise. And this is exactly what this is. I mean, Theresa May has made it absolutely clear there's not going to be a second referendum. And it's the last thing that anybody in this country would want, is another few months of going through the ideology, the battles, again, we were told by David Cameron in 2015 on the 10th of November in his Chatham House speech that anybody who thinks that there is going to be a second referendum, think again. This is once in a generation, and that is it. And that's what we've had. And so it's been 52% to 48%. We're now getting on. And a lot of the legislation that is necessary for trade and for leaving the European Union is already going through Parliament. And of course, Nigel Farage had the opportunity to stand for the Westminster Parliament when we had the general election last year. He decided not to.
You mentioned the margin of victory. If you look at the tracker polls right now, the Leave cause, having been sort of bumbling along around sort of 2% margin ahead of the other side, and now something like 9% ahead. So if the polls are to be believed, and we know from the previous experience that's a big if, it will be a slam dunk.
It is a big if, and of course Aaron Banks himself said when he was told about one of those polls, he said 10%. That's where the Remain side were, 10% ahead as we went into the referendum on the 23rd of June. So it's pointless going through this particular exercise as to trying to test the waters with how people feel at this moment in time as to how they really felt when we had the referendum in 2016. Last year we had a bitter experience of the opinion polls. We went into a general election when the Conservatives were 24 points ahead in the opinion polls. And as you know, we ended up 1 point ahead. So everybody knows, and actually this is not just about, I know what Nigel said about people like Andrew Adonis and others who feel very strongly about the European Union, and if we have a second referendum, this will put it to bed for a generation. Well, you're joking. When you've got people like Michael Heseltine, Ken Clarke, Andrew Adonis, Anna Soubry, Nicky Morgan, it'll never put it to bed for them.
Justin Greening.
Maybe Justine Greening as well.
Maybe maybe.
Yeah, but maybe just maybe. But I don't discount the depth of feeling and love that these people have for the European Union. But my love for democracy is even greater. And when you've got a Prime Minister who talks about just before the referendum that this is once in a lifetime and there's not going to be a second referendum, you are really attacking democracy, and you are really questioning the integrity of any other referendum that's ever held in the United Kingdom. People will believe that, as long as it's within a few margin points of the result, then maybe if they carry on protesting and making a noise, we could have a second referendum. Yeah. And I know Nigel, he's a bit like a brawler in search of a fight. But the fact is that the fight is over.
We've done
our 12 rounds. The towel has now been thrown in. There is a clear victor, and it's now time to move on. And that's exactly what Nigel Farage will do. Love him as I do. I don't want to hear several more months of Nigel Farage talking about a second referendum.
But I mean, for all we enjoyed your similarly suggesting he's like the broken down machine. One arm band in the corner of the fruit machine.
Yes.
Thank you. Fruit machine in the corner of the pub. He's not acting entirely alone here. There's a whiff of acting in concert. Aaron Banks was very swift to add his voice to this idea.
Yeah, but a year earlier, from the referendum, Aaron Banks actually called it nuts, the idea of a second referendum. So as much as they think that this idea is going to put it to sleep if we have a second referendum, what happens if that's another margin of 52 to 48, one way or the other? It doesn't really matter. Does that really put it to bed? No. There'd be cause for a third referendum and another referendum at the end of the process. Well, the fact is now we've had that referendum. The legislation is going through Parliament, and Parliament will have the opportunity to vote about the deal that we finally end up with. But this sort of noises off really doesn't help. We've had the vote, and everybody should now respect the vote. Even George Osborne, post the referendum, as much as he didn't like it, said he did respect the views of the referendum. Even Juncker and Barnier have said that they respect the views of the British people. And I think we've just got to do that and move on.
Is there not one little bit of you, however, which already feels a whiff of nostalgia for that heady few months when the weather was briefly supplanted as the only topic of conversation in the checkout queue, etc., etc. Politics came alive. It gripped the nation. Families were riven by it. It was serious stuff. Politics, your passion, became the most important thing in the country for a few months, and we'd return to that.
Yeah, do you know, Colin, you're absolutely right. It did grip the nation, and over 72% of the population turned out to vote. As far as the actual numbers of people are concerned, it's the largest exercise in democracy this country has ever seen. And therefore, I think we now need to respect that. We're not going to have the best of three referendums. We've had the debate. It was quite bruising, I've got to say. It divided families. It divided the United Kingdom, with Wales and England voting for and Northern Ireland and Scotland voting to remain. It divided a lot of friends as well. We don't want to go through that exercise again. And as I said, it would damage the integrity of future referenda in this country if we were to decide at this moment now, because there are a few people who really do passionately more believe in the European Union than they believe in democracy, that they would like another bite at the cherry. Well, there's not much of the cherry going to be left if we carry on with that sort of argument. There'll only be the pip left. So, and that's worth nothing. So let's just move on. And Nigel, we love you to death. You deserve recognition for the fact that we got that first referendum in the first place. But I believe that what you said earlier on in 2016, which is that there shouldn't be a second referendum. Arron Banks called it nuts. I think it's bonkers. Time to move on.
Nigel Evans, thanks very much.
Colin.
OK, well, let's move on to the rest of the day's news now. And the former UKIP leader Nigel Farage says he's warming to the idea of a second referendum on EU membership. Mr Farage, who played a big role in securing the Brexit vote, says it would kill off the Remain campaign for good. Well, our political correspondent Carl Dinnan is in Westminster tonight. So, Carl, what's behind, then, his possible change of tune?
Well, because he thinks it would settle the argument once and for all. Of course, it's usually those who argue to stay in the EU who want to have a second referendum on whatever the final deal is because they think they would win. So you can imagine their surprise when up pops Nigel Farage saying he's joining the second referendum side of the argument, albeit because he says Leave would win again.
So maybe, just maybe, I'm reaching the point of thinking that we should have a second referendum. If we had a second referendum on EU membership, we'd kill it off for a generation. The percentage that would vote to leave next time would be very much bigger than it was last time.
All those Remainers said, great, bring it on. Let's have that second referendum. UKIP, and then remember, Nigel Farage is still a UKIP MEP, were a lot less impressed, saying, hang on, that's not party policy, we don't want one. And Downing Street said, well, there's not going to be a second referendum. What's actually interesting is that both sides are so convinced they would win again. Polling shows that although there's been a bit of a shift to Remain, it's still very, very tight. And in fact, most people, when asked, including many Remainers, wish the government would just get on and deliver Brexit.
Carl Dinnan at Westminster, thank you.
The former UKIP leader, Nigel Farage, is flirting with the idea of there being another referendum on EU membership. He said it could shut up people who he called Remoaning politicians, as a new vote in favour of leaving would be so huge. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster. What's he up to?
Well, he's using that sort of florid language about how he wants to stop people moaning, but I think what he actually wants to stop is what he sees as the dilution of Brexit. He thinks that this government is tacking too close to Europe, not being as drastic, as definitive in its breakaway from Europe as he would like. And he thinks, as you say, a second referendum could crush such deviant behaviour and bring things back in line with where he always envisaged Brexit being. This is how he actually put it on TV today.
My mind is actually changing on this.
Go on.
What is for certain is that the Cleggs, the Blairs, the Adonises will never, ever, ever give up. They will go on whinging and whining and moaning all the way through this process. So maybe, just maybe, I'm reaching the point of thinking that we should have a second referendum
on what?
On EU membership.
The whole thing?
Yes, of course, of course. If we had a second referendum on EU membership, we'd kill it off for a generation. The percentage that would vote to leave next time would be very much bigger than it was last time round.
Well, there's some people, these critics, are saying this is just Nigel Farage crying for more attention. Amazingly, the people who were actually embracing him, not physically, of course, today, were the Remain side. The forces for Remain, who want to stay inside the European Union, have been trying to coalesce the various groups, and they've been coalescing around the idea of a second referendum. And it's Nick Clegg and other people like him who've been saying, I agree with Nigel today. The real criticism has been coming from a lot of the people who were actually campaigning on his side, fellow Brexiteers, in the referendum. A lot of it from what he would consider the establishment Brexit campaign, not the one he was part of, but the Vote Leave campaign, the one that got official designation. There you find very strong view that those people think it would be mad to go to the electorate again. They're not convinced the electorate would reject Brexit and stick with Remain, but they think it would be incredibly risky to roll the dice again. I should say that it looks from the polls as though that crushing victory is not out there at the moment. The balance of forces is more or less where it was. What there is out there is a crushing vote against the idea of a second vote. People just don't want it.
Gary
Thanks, Gary.
in Westminster.
Does anyone really think there should be a second referendum on our decision to leave the EU? The latest advocate of a return to the ballot box came from unexpected quarters this morning. Nigel Farage told Channel 5's The Right Stuff that he was warming to the idea and believed a second vote would result in another much bigger win in favour of Brexit. Have a listen.
My mind is actually changing on this.
Go on.
What is for certain is that the Cleggs, the Blairs, the Adonises will never, ever, ever give up. They will go on whinging and whining and moaning all the way through this process. So maybe, just maybe, I'm reaching the point of thinking that we should have a second referendum
on what?
On EU membership.
The whole thing?
Yes, of course, of course. Unless you want to have a multiple choice referendum.
No.
Which would confuse people.
I'm
I think if we had a second referendum on EU membership, we'd kill it off for a generation. The percentage that would vote to leave next time would be very much bigger than it was last time round. And we may just finish the whole thing off.
Well, we'll be opening that up in a moment with our guest right here. But first, our political editor, Nick Watt. The story doesn't quite end here, Nick.
That's right. A slight rowing back by Nigel Farage this evening in the Daily Telegraph. He's gone from what you heard there, saying maybe we should have a second referendum, to I fear that maybe there will be a second referendum if Parliament votes down the deal. Now, today he spoke out because obviously Brexiteers were very strongly critical of him, and Remainers said thank you very much. Now, all of this was sparked off last week when Tony Blair said that the British people should have the right to have a say either in an election or in a referendum on that final deal. So earlier today, I spoke to Tony Blair's former Director of Communications, Alistair Campbell, and this is what he had to say.
And I think actually Nigel Farage, I think one of the reasons that Farage and Johnson and these guys are getting a little bit desperate and just trying to take the ball into the corner flag and just get the final whistle blown is because I think they understand that as people do see the detail, do realise the cost and the chaos, then not only should they have the right to think again, but I think they'll want to think again, and I think they'll give a very different answer.
And everyone thinks that the polls would now go their way, which is fascinating. How do the polls actually
Well, interestingly, tonight there's a snap poll in the Daily Mirror done by Comres after those Nigel Farage remarks, and that shows that there's only minority support for a second referendum, 43 to 51%, but it shows a majority support for Remain, 55 to 45. But it is a snap poll. Better to look at the YouGov monthly tracker on that question, which asks, is it right or wrong to have left the European Union? And that shows basically even Stevens, though since August it was wrong to leave the EU, has been ahead, although there was a blip last month which showed that the Leave side were 9 points ahead, although important to say that was asked in a different context, so there are questions about that particular finding. So today we spoke to Deborah Mattinson of Britain Thinks.
So we've been tracking this at Britain Thinks over the last 18 months, and the really fascinating thing is that people's fundamental views haven't changed at all in that time. So really nothing has changed other than people are more worried. But I think the one thing you have to factor in when you think about this is the youth vote. Of course, what we know is that many more young people voted in the last election, people who didn't vote in the referendum. If they still vote, then that could change things.
Deborah Matheson. Well, let's pick up with our guest now. Joining us is Diane James, who was for a brief period the leader of UKIP and remains an MEP for the party. Lucy Thomas, who was Deputy Director of the Remain campaign. And Jeroen Dijsselbloem, the former Dutch Finance Minister and outgoing President of the Eurogroup of Eurozone Finance Ministers. It's very nice to have you all here. I'm going to pick up with you, Diane. What was he thinking?
I'm not sure. What was he smoking? I think ought to be the next question.
So it took all of you by surprise?
Yes, it did. I mean, this is the sort of thing that Nigel has got form for. He does come out with these, let's call them rather outrageous statements. In putting it into context, though, and I'm just going to give a personal response, I can understand his frustration with the fact that the Remainers have not given up in terms of trying to overturn the decision. You know, when you hear that Tony Blair launches a fund of £10 million and that there are other organisations endorsed by the likes of Sir Nick Clegg and such that still want to overturn a democratic vote, it really is quite unbelievable. But it's going to be interesting to see where this actually goes.
Would you be up for the fight?
Oh, yes, of course I would. You know, I mean, and I think the most important thing is why I brought this document with me. This whole future of Europe now, this was a document released to the MEPs in, I think it was October of last year. This actually fleshes out the future of the European Union. It's a frightening document in terms of the degree of control.
We've got the perfect person here to talk to us about that. I'll come to you in a second.
When that's in the public domain, it will be interesting to see how people react.
Lucy, would you relish a second chance at this?
Well, I think for me, it was a democratic decision. You know, people have had their say. And I sort of want to ask Nigel Farage, why can't you accept you've won? You know, what is it about this that you don't accept? I think for me, I've known Nigel Farage probably about 10 years, and he just loves a fight. He loves campaigning.
You think this is about publicity?
I do. I think he wants to remain relevant.
Diane's point, though, was that Tony Blair, Nick Clegg still feel that this wasn't won on democratic terms because of the false promises made. So is that enough of a reason to go back to the polls?
I think there are some former Remainers who would like there to be a second referendum and have spoken about that. But going back to what Nick was saying about the polls, you know, public opinion hasn't shifted. There isn't a massive clamour for a second referendum. So I don't think that there is a big push for that. You can think about perhaps once the terms are known, were people to suddenly be up in arms and say, you know, we don't like these terms, we want a second go. But for the moment, the polls simply aren't there.
You were right at the vanguard of that fight, Deputy Director. Would you fight this in a very different way? Do you look back with your head in your hands at the way the Remain campaign went about that?
I think it was a very, very hard campaign to fight, given that people were... When we first started the campaign, it was about 50-50. People, when we spoke to people in focus groups, there was no real concept of what the positives of remaining in the EU were. And so within a 6-month campaign, there was a huge amount of work to do to land those positives. What is it that we get from being in the EU? So I think it's a very, very hard discussion, not least because in a referendum where there are two choices and it's a very complicated question, people can put all sorts of different things into the pot and are voting to take back control of whatever it is that they choose to put into the pot.
Let's pick up with that in a moment. But Jeroen Dijsselbloem, what is Europe thinking about Brexit right now?
What, today, after this cry for a second referendum? So I haven't heard anyone in Brussels argue for a second referendum. I think people in Brussels are waiting for sort of what does the UK government want to have in the end deal? What does it look like? We're asking for clarity on that so we can move forward on that.
So it's up to the UK government to decide what that looks like then?
To have a negotiating position, yes, indeed, that will be very helpful. But no one in Brussels is questioning the mandate that the UK government has coming out of that first referendum. That mandate is quite clear. There's going to be a Brexit. And we're trying to sort out all these very complicated questions on what does it look like, the future relationship. Now, so my argument will be, let's focus on trying to solve these issues and minimize the losses, because there's going to be losses on all sides. Let's focus on that rather than reopening the debate and going back to zero.
It is a delicious irony that the only person questioning the mandate then is UKIP's former leader, Nigel Farage. I mean, does it suggest, as Lucy said, that he just wants to be back in the centre of attention now? Or does he think that it isn't convincing enough people that it's going in the right direction?
I think he's got two perspectives, two objectives, Emily. One, he wants to expose the degree of resistance from the Remainers that still is with them in terms of they are absolutely determined to overturn that decision.
Sorry, I'm not at all, and I was the deputy head of the Remain campaign, and I'm saying it's a democratic decision. So there isn't this.
No, but Tony Blair and Nick Clegg are two individuals leading this Remain issue of overturning that democratic decision, and the Labour Party is being very interesting in terms of denying its position that it would actually, everything that it wants currently would mean staying in the European Union.
That's absolutely not right. I mean, just to quote Nigel Farage for a second, he said before the referendum, if it were to be narrow, if it were to be 52 for Remain, 48 to leave, that would be unfinished business, was his quote, and he said he would carry on fighting. So for those people who were former Remainers and who would want a second go, Nigel Farage himself said 52-48 was too narrow and it would be unfinished business.
Okay.
So what has changed?
Well, in which case we've got Tony Blair, Nick Clegg, Nigel Farage all sitting in a particular corner saying, wait a minute, we still believe, given the position we've taken previously, that it's unfinished business. I'm agreeing with you on that point.
But
The
they're
interesting
agreeing
thing
with
is,
him,
of
that's
course,
the point.
that we think we've left Europe in a certain place. Europe has moved on. Europe is more interested in more integration post-Britain, isn't it? I mean, that has been the talk.
Well, you have to realise, and I think the people in the UK have to understand, that the Brexit is no longer on the front pages in Europe and hasn't been for some months.
Is it on any of the pages?
It's on the front pages in the UK every day, page 1, 2 and 3. But if you open up the papers on the continent, you'll find very little on Brexit. We have moved on.
So nobody in Europe is trying to convince Britain to stay now, is that what you're saying?
You'll find individuals, but there is no drive to reopen this debate.
That's not entirely true, is it? Because you've got the German automotive industry in the last few days actually highlighting the dangers that Brexit is going to have for their German manufacturing industry because of the degree, the volume of cars exported.
Look, it's a bad idea.
So you're now agreeing with the German manufacturers' concerns,
I'm highlighting to Jerome that there is an industry that is, and it was in Bild, for instance, it was in Spiegel, so to say that it's not being covered by the European press is untrue.
Do you think the no-deal concept is a very clever way of bringing Europe right to the table where Theresa May needs to start those negotiations?
My sense is that some strategic politicians in the UK thought that if they said they threatened us with a no deal, that would be helpful for their negotiating position. Now it's completely backfired, because now in Europe people are preparing for the possible outcome of no deal, and the British government is in panic.
Lucy,
saying how can it be that they're preparing a no deal? Look, it's going to be a bad situation. It's a bad decision. The German car industry is right. It's a bad decision.
For Europe as well as...
It's a political fact for us. And now we need to concentrate on minimising the damage and getting a good outcome.
Isn't the truth, Lucy, that the Europe that we will leave in 2 years' time will be a very different shape and feel to the Europe that we're part of now?
Yes, and that's why Nigel Farage talking about an in-out referendum. It's sort of like, well, in what, in a way? Because what would those terms be? I think it's not right to say we would go into what we had before. I agree entirely. I think it's you know, the decision has been made. Europe is moving on, and I think, you know, Brexit will happen.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you too.